We all know World War II was one of the deadliest wars in history. But have you ever wondered why? I mean, you might think it's because of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? Well, that's a good guess, but it's not even close. You see, those bombs only accounted for around 200,000 deaths. And while they certainly were an important event, they are a tiny fraction of the overall death toll. Most people also don't realize just how big the Pacific theater of war was. I'm talking about an area that stretches from the frigid waters off the coast of Japan to the tropical islands of the South Pacific and all the way down under to the deserts of northern Australia. It was a massive area and fighting took place over a huge swath of it. Even so, the Pacific claimed something like 600,000 military lives and maybe another 1 or 2 million civilian lives. Again, a lot of people, but not even close to the total. You see, World War II was really a global war, meaning that fighting wasn't just happening in the Pacific or in Europe. It was happening all over the world, including in places like North Africa, the Middle East, and even parts of Southeast Asia. All told, somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died in World War II. But where did most of them die? To answer that question, we need to go to the largest theater of war, the Eastern Front. The fighting there was truly apocalyptic, unlike anything the world had ever seen. So buckle up, because here comes one of the bloodiest chapters in human history. The Eastern Front was the part of World War II that was fought between Germany and the Soviet Union. It started when Germany invaded the USSR on June 1941. At the time, Russia was led by Joseph Stalin, who had ruled the country since the early 1920s. Stalin had always been suspicious of the Germans, and for good reason too, since they had just spent a decade cozying up to his sworn enemy, Adolf Hitler. But Stalin still didn't believe that the Germans would actually attack him. In fact, he had long believed that if war ever broke out between the two countries, he would have plenty of time to prepare. Unfortunately, he was wrong. From the moment that German troops crossed into Russia, everything went wrong for the Soviets. Their troops were woefully unprepared, and their military infrastructure was completely caught off guard. This allowed the Germans to advance very far into Russia during the summer of 1941. By September, they had advanced over 600 miles and were approaching Moscow itself. It seemed as though the Germans would soon capture the city and deal a death blow to the Soviet military. But then something unexpected happened. Winter came. The cold was so intense that it actually halted the fighting for a few months. But when the fighting resumed in the spring of 1942, the Soviets were ready for the Germans. They had spent the winter training new troops and building up their defenses. This time the Germans weren't able to advance nearly as far. They pushed forward a bit, but then they got stuck. This led to some of the most brutal fighting of the entire war. For 4 long years, the Germans and the Soviets fought to a bloody stalemate. Entire armies were wiped out. Major cities were reduced to rubble and countless lives were lost. It was an absolute nightmare, but eventually the tide began to turn. The Soviets were able to push the Germans back little by little until finally, in the summer of 1945, they pushed all the way into Berlin. The fighting ended soon after, with the total destruction of the German army. All told, about 40 million people died on the Eastern Front, about 80% of the total number of military personnel who died in the war. When you add in the civilian deaths, the total comes out to about 43 million. That's why if you want to understand what made World War II the deadliest war of all time, you just need to look at the Eastern Front. In December of 1941, the United States had just under 2,500 planes. Today it's hard to even imagine how the US would be able to fight World War II with only 2,500 planes. But that was the situation they were in right before Pearl Harbor. They simply didn't anticipate an attack coming. But within just a few years, by 1945, the US was using over 300,000 aircraft during World War II. So how did this happen? How did the US go from having just under 2,500 planes to over 300,000 planes in just 4 years? Well, today we're going to find out. The United States didn't really have an official airplane manufacturing industry prior to World War II. They had some companies like Boeing and Douglas that were building planes for commercial airlines in other countries, but they weren't producing planes for the US military. It just didn't seem like something they'd need anytime soon. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor, everything changed. All of a sudden, the US military needed as many planes as they could get, and that meant that they had to turn to the commercial aircraft manufacturers to build them. But building planes isn't easy. It's not like building cars where you can just put an engine in a chassis and then slap some body panels on top of it. There's so many moving parts in a plane that it takes months to build one. So the companies who were used to building commercial airliners had to completely retool their factories to start making military aircraft instead. For example, Boeing had been building the B-747 up until 1941, when the government told them to stop making commercial planes and start making military planes instead. But even after all that, it took months to tool the factory to make military planes. And it wasn't until 1943 that Boeing was finally making enough planes to meet military demand. And it wasn't just the commercial aircraft companies that were building planes either. In fact, some of the biggest plane manufacturers today got their start during World War II. For example, Northrop started out as a small propeller manufacturer, but then expanded into building trainer aircraft for the military. Similarly, Lockheed was a small company that was contracted to build the Vega 3 single-engine plane. But after that contract was finished, they were given a contract to build the P-36 fighter plane. But all of these companies combined couldn't build planes fast enough to meet military demand. The US military needed planes for training, for escorting bombers, for bombing runs, and for fighting in the Pacific, but with the aircraft companies struggling to even produce enough trainers, how did they get all of these planes? Well, part of the answer was to simply get the planes from other countries. Prior to 1941, the US wasn't really involved in any foreign conflicts, so they didn't really have any need to purchase planes from other countries, but once they got involved in World War II, all of a sudden they had the money to spend on foreign aircraft. For example, the US purchased large numbers of British and Canadian aircraft, including the Hawker Hurricane and the Avro, Canada's famous CF-18. But even after all of this, the US was still falling behind. They needed more planes and they needed them yesterday. So the US government did what any rational government would do. They turned to the people. The government started a mass manufacturing campaign, encouraging all Americans to get involved in the war effort by working in factories building planes. Thousands of women entered the workforce to take over the jobs that men had left to go fight in the war, and soon, factories were turning out planes faster than ever before. The US went from having just under 2,500 planes in December of 1941 to over 300,000 aircraft by the end of the war. This is an incredible feat when you consider that it took almost 80 years for the US to reach 1 million aircraft. So there you have it, that's how the US went from 2,500 planes to over 300,000 planes in just a few years. It was a combination of the government's efforts to encourage commercial aircraft manufacturers to start making military planes, the US government purchasing planes from other countries, and the US government encouraging its citizens to get involved in the war effort by working in factories building planes. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. 6 years, 8 months, 1 day. That's how long World War II lasted, from Germany's invasion of Poland to Japan's surrender, from September 1st, 1939 to September 2nd, 1945. And in that time, some 70 to 85 million people died. That's a lot of people. A lot. But how many people exactly? Well, let's do the math. We'll start with the high estimate, 85 million. If we divide that by 365, the number of days in a non-leap year, we get roughly 233,000 dead per day. Now, World War II was not a non-leap year. It had 2 leap years, 1940 and 1944. So technically, if we're going to be precise, we should add an extra day to the total. Now, 233,000 is still a lot of people, but it's a lot more manageable than 85 million. We can picture a line of 233,000 people. We could line them up shoulder to shoulder and they would stretch for over 10 kilometers. Or we could lay them down end to end and they would cover more than 225 American football fields. It'd be quite the sight, though maybe not a very pleasant one. So 233,000 dead every day for 6 years, give or take a couple, equals 8,429,000 dead. But that's not the highest estimate. The highest estimate is 85 million. So where does the other 76 million go? Well, to get the other 76 million, we have to go back to the beginning, because to get the other 76 million, we actually have to start with the smaller number, the low estimate, which is 70 million. 70 million divided by 365 is about 191,000. Now again, we have to account for the leap years, so that actually brings it up to 192,000. Okay, so now we're at 70 million. Do the math, 192,000 dead every day for 6 years gives us 67,380,000 dead. And that still leaves us 3 million short of the high estimate. So what do? Well, the answer is pretty simple. We find the difference between the two estimates, which is 15 million, and then we divide that by the number of days in the war, 2,120, and that gives us about 6,000. So every day of World War II, somewhere between 192,000 and 233,000 people died. Somewhere between 6,000 and 13,000 every hour, somewhere between 100 and 133 every minute, and somewhere between 1 and 2 every second. There are a lot of ways to remember the victims of World War II, ceremonies, monuments, museums, but maybe the most important thing to remember is just to remember all the numbers, the big ones and the small ones, because they all add up to real people, millions of real people. And when we forget that, when we stop remembering, that's when it starts to slip away. That's when the lessons are forgotten. That's why it's important to remember not just the big events of World War II, but also the little ones, the things like this. The death of an unnamed German soldier. We know very little about him. We don't know his name, his rank, or even really anything about him. All we know is that he died on July 22nd, 1941, near Vitebsk, Russia, just a few months after the German invasion. But in those few months, he managed to make an impact on the world, albeit an unintentional one. You see, he didn't die by some grand event, a battle or a bombing or an assassination. He died in a small town in a place that became known as the massacre at Chaitin. He and his unit rounded up hundreds of Soviet POWs and then executed them. Then they went to the neighboring village and did the same thing. And they executed more than 100 people there. And then they moved on to the next village and the next, killing hundreds more. We don't know much about this German soldier, but we do know this, that in a moment of humanity, amid all that horror, he was killed by a Soviet partisan shot in the head while trying to bayonet a woman. That's all we know. That, and the fact that his body was later found by villagers, dumped in a mass grave along with dozens of others. But perhaps that is enough. Maybe his story isn't about who he was or what he did, but about what happened to him, what happened to all of them, the victims of the massacre at Chaitin. In the end, their stories are our stories, our collective story, the story of humanity. And it's up to us to remember it, all of it, the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies. Because that's the only way we learn, the only way we grow, and the only way we can make sure it never happens again. In 1943, the Nazis spent what would be the modern-day equivalent of $100 million to build an underground base in what was then German-occupied Poland. The base was huge. It had its own rail line, barracks, hospital, power plant, storage space for supplies, and even an air raid shelter. But once finished, it saw little use. And after the war ended in 1945, it was abandoned. Today, it's home to more than 500,000 bats. This is that story. Now back to our base. It was constructed between 1942 and 1943 in what was then the village of Kisilitz, about 60 miles from the front lines. At the time the Germans were losing the war. They were low on oil and other critical resources, and morale was plummeting. So Hitler decided that he needed somewhere safe to hole up and ride out the war. Construction on the site began in January of 1942, when workers carved into the hillside with picks and shovels. They created a sprawling network of tunnels that could accommodate up to 4,000 soldiers. A year later, construction was completed on what was known as the Wewelsburg complex, or the Ries complex, named for the construction company that built it. By early 1943, the entire facility covered nearly 10 square miles. The complex was supposed to be self-sufficient. It had its own rail line that connected to the barracks, hospital, power plant, storage space for supplies, and even an air raid shelter. There was also an armory, a laundry, a kitchen, workshops, living quarters, and offices. In fact, everything that Hitler and his troops would need to sustain themselves for years was brought in and stockpiled. Food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, chemicals, weapons, and even beds. Construction workers slept in the barracks. Nearby, Hitler's personal chef oversaw the preparation of meals in the enormous kitchen. An SS guard stood watch at all times at the entrance to the tunnels, and anyone who entered or exited the facility was subject to a search. It was here in this seemingly impenetrable fortress that Hitler planned to ride out the war. He even ordered that the surrounding forest be cleared so that no one could hide nearby while making their way into the tunnels. But before he could move in, the Allies began bombing the area and the underground base was severely damaged. Now, it's unclear what prompted the decision to abandon the facility. Perhaps it was simply too dangerous for the remaining troops to stay there? Or maybe the Germans pulled their things and got out of Dodge because they knew that the Soviets were advancing and would likely capture the base. Either way, the troops left behind everything they'd brought in, including food and supplies, and they retreated north toward Germany. Soon after, the Soviets captured the tunnels and turned them into a museum. Then, in 1958, the Polish government took over the site and sealed off the entrance to the tunnels. For decades, locals knew that there was something under the hill, but didn't know what. Some believed that the tunnels were hiding a Nazi treasure. Others thought there were secret escape tunnels leading out of the area, and some even believed that there were human remains buried beneath the surface. In the late 1990s, people began exploring the tunnels anyway. Over the years, they've become one of the largest bat habitats in Europe, with more than 500,000 bats calling the tunnels home. While exploration of the bunkers is illegal in Poland, tourists can take guided tours of the site and see these fascinating creatures in their natural habitat. Bats have been around for about 50 million years, and today there are more than 400 species of bats worldwide. These animals can be found on every continent except Antarctica, and they make up about 20% of all mammal species. As far as we know, only bats and humans have intentionally built structures to live in. And unlike human dwellings, bat houses are usually pretty easy to spot. They are typically mounted on trees or buildings and are designed to mimic the shapes of hollowed out trees where bats like to roost. A lot of people have been asking, what if the United Kingdom and France had merged into one country in 1940? Well, it turns out that this was actually proposed by the British government, and it almost certainly would have happened if the French hadn't been having a massive existential crisis at the time. In June of 1940, the British politician Lord Croft proposed that the UK and France merge to become one country during the Second World War. According to Croft, this new country would consist of the United Kingdom and the French territories, including the French mainland, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Madagascar, and all the French colonies. The union would last for the duration of the war, and any peace treaty between the two countries would need to be submitted to a vote by the citizens of both countries. Basically, this proposal entailed a political union between the two countries, similar to how the UK and Ireland were in a political union before Ireland got its independence. If we zoom out a bit, this wasn't the first time that someone had suggested merging the UK and France. Back in 1911, a French politician named Georges Clemenceau had suggested a Franco-British union, although that was mainly just Clemenceau trying to get some domestic political clout. But during the First World War, there were several more serious attempts at creating a political union between the two countries, mostly by the British. The most serious attempt being Lord Robert Cecil asking Clemenceau if he would be interested in merging the two countries after the war in 1917. Naturally, Clemenceau said no. But back to the Second World War, what would this Anglo-French union look like? Well, according to Croft, this new country would share a single parliament in London with delegates from France. There would be a single army led by a British general and a single navy led by a French admiral. Both countries would contribute their resources to the war effort, and Britain would send 40,000 food and raw materials to France every month. Additionally, both countries would adopt the same economic policy, and France would join the British Commonwealth of Nations. Most importantly though, the people of both countries would be considered single citizens of this new country. So if you were French or British during the Second World War, you could say that you were a citizen of two countries at the same time. And while the idea of double citizenship might sound appealing today, back then it would have been a pretty big deal. In fact, most countries today don't even allow dual citizenship. So why didn't this happen? Well, it turns out that the French government actually did consider this proposal seriously. However, they were in the middle of an existential crisis at the time. After the German invasion of France in May 1940, the French government fled to Tours in the southwest of the country, which caused the British to believe that the French were going to leave the war effort. When Croft sent his proposal to Paris, the French Foreign Ministry didn't even bother reading it, and instead immediately sent it to the British with a note saying that the French government was too busy to deal with this right now. A few weeks later, the French government signed an armistice with Germany, and the Franco-British Union was dead in the water. However, it isn't beyond the realm of possibility that this would have happened if the timing had been just a little bit different. Had Croft proposed the union just a few days earlier, it's possible that the French government would have been open to the idea. As the Foreign Ministry clerk who received Croft's proposal said, "If it had been 2 days earlier, I would have handed it over to the Foreign Minister. As it was, we did not even read it." So just a few days earlier, and the world could have looked very different today. Hey, and since we're talking about alternate history here, let me throw this out there. What if the UK and France did merge in 1940? How do you think that would have affected the outcome of the war? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. And on that somewhat depressing note, this has been the last episode of this series. I want to thank all of you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this series as much as I've enjoyed making it. There's something very interesting going on in this small town in Canada. It has a population of only 413 people, and it's called Swastika. You see, during World War II, the Ontario government wanted to change its name because, well, it was a little too similar to that of a certain German fellow who was quite popular at the time. So they asked the residents if they would be willing to change their town's name to something else. But the people of Swastika said no. They said, to hell with Hitler, we came up with our name first. That's one heck of a statement. And even more impressive is the fact that they actually managed to keep it. Most people don't know much about this small town or even that this event took place, so today I will tell you all about it. If you like stories like this, then make sure to hit that subscribe button because I have a lot more where that came from. Also, give this video a like and let's get started. So the town of Swastika is located in northern Ontario, about 200 kilometers northeast of Sudbury. Its population is just 413 people, and it's known for having one of the oldest continuously operated gold mines in the world right nearby. The mine opened in 1936 and is still operating to this day. Who knows? Maybe the name of the town had something to do with the mine and not Hitler at all. Well, actually, that's not true. The name swastika was chosen by the railroad that passed through the settlement in 1903. They named it after a local First Nations legend. Long ago there were two brothers, one good and one evil. The good brother was called Swastika, and his symbol was the sun. The evil brother was called Sasagias, and his symbol was the moon. Every night the two brothers would race across the sky. Swastika, the good brother, would try to catch up to Sasagias and bring light to the darkness, but he never did. The people of the First Nation believed that the swastika symbol represented the sun and the endless cycle of day and night. It's safe to say that when the railroad workers found out about this legend, they thought it was quite fitting for a town. But things were about to change. In September of 1939, World War II was raging in Europe, and Canada had recently declared war against Germany. A few months later, a representative from the Ontario government contacted the mayor of Swastika and informed him that the name of the town had to be changed because of, the whole German thing. He offered them three alternatives: Cochrane, New Ontario, Matheson, and Paget. But the people of Swastika weren't thrilled with any of these options. In February of 1940, a meeting was held in the town hall to discuss the matter. More than 100 people attended, and nearly everyone was against changing the name. They felt that it wasn't their fault that Hitler had chosen the same symbol. Heck, the town had been called Swastika for 37 years before Hitler came into power. Some people even suggested that the town's name should be changed to something else, like Quebec or Dunkirk. Others simply wanted to keep the original name. The debate was getting heated, so the mayor decided to put the decision to a vote. He sent out 350 ballots to the residents of Swastika, and they were given three options: change the name to Cochrane, change the name to Matheson, or keep the name Swastika. Residents could also write in another option, but it had to be one of the other two. Out of the 287 ballots that were returned, 227 were in favor of keeping the name Swastika. Once the results were announced, the people of Swastika breathed a sigh of relief. They had managed to keep their town's name despite the pressure from the provincial government. To this day, the town of Swastika proudly displays a sign that reads, Swastika, Ontario, Incorporated 1929. A man jumps out of a burning plane at 5,500 meters with no parachute. You're probably thinking I'm full of it, but this actually happened during World War II. And when the Germans captured the British tail gunner, they didn't believe his story either. But after investigating, they had to admit that he was telling the truth. They even gave him a certificate to prove it. But why? Why would the Germans give an award to a British airman for jumping out of a plane without a parachute? Well, let me explain. It all started in June of 1943 when a British bomber was flying over Germany. The aircraft was hit and set on fire. The pilot immediately ordered the crew to bail out. Everyone managed to get out safely except for the tail gunner. When the plane crashed, the villagers reported seeing a man jump out of the burning aircraft. But surely he must have been crazy or suicidal, right? Surely no one could survive a fall from 5,500 meters without a parachute. Well, someone did. And when the Germans captured the tail gunner, they were astounded by his story. His name was Sergeant John Robert Pullman, and he was a member of the Royal Canadian Air Force. He told the Germans that he was the only one of 7 crew members who managed to escape. He said that the order to bail out was given just before the plane hit the ground, forcing him to make a last-minute jump. He also told them that he'd reached an altitude of 5,500 meters when he jumped out of the plane without a parachute. This was incredible. Even if he had jumped out of the plane with a parachute, it would still be quite a feat to survive a fall from that height. But he said he jumped without one. The Germans didn't believe him, so they decided to investigate. They wanted to know if Sergeant Pullman had really jumped from such a great height and if he'd survived the landing. But how could they possibly find out? It's not like they could send a team up to 5,500 meters to look for evidence. Well, fortunately, they didn't need to. All they needed to do was look up in the sky. See, when Sergeant Pullman jumped out of the plane, there was a hole in the aircraft where his parachute should have been. The Germans could clearly see this because the plane had landed in a village, causing quite a commotion among the locals. The villagers had even managed to put out the fire. But what really caught their attention was the hole in the plane. The Germans sent some experts to examine the aircraft, and they quickly confirmed that Sergeant Pullman had indeed jumped out of the plane without a parachute. Someone even managed to take a photograph of the hole. That's how we have this picture today. But why did the Germans give him an award for this? Wouldn't it make more sense to punish him for abandoning ship? Well, that's not what Sergeant Pullman did. He didn't abandon his post. His plane was hit and there was no way he could stay in it any longer. He had to jump out, and to make matters worse, when he did jump out, his parachute wasn't working properly. He tried to fix it, but it was too late. He had to cut it away and hope for the best. He was very lucky to survive. In fact, it was nothing short of a miracle. After the war, Sergeant Pullman received many medals for his bravery, including the Distinguished Flying Medal. He passed away in 1988, but his story is still told today. There are even people who doubt it ever happened. But it did. And to think that it was only thanks to a hole in the plane that the Germans found that they were able to confirm it. Now, what do you think? Do you think Sergeant Pullman was a hero or just a guy who was lucky to survive? Let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to check out these videos which pop up on your screen right now. Thanks for watching and see you next time. It is June 1944 and Allied troops are preparing to take the beaches of Normandy in what will become known as D-Day. For the English soldiers about to embark on this nearly impossible mission, their survival will depend on their ability to fight off not only the heavily armed German soldiers defending the beach, but also the threat of infiltration by enemy spies. With thousands of lives hanging in the balance, can they be sure that every single one of their men is on their side? The answer, thanks to some clever linguists, is no, because while it may seem obvious now, back then it was actually very easy to infiltrate Allied lines by simply knowing the language of your enemy. And so to combat this, the British and American armies took a page out of the spy's handbook and started using secret codes and passwords that were nearly impossible for enemy infiltrators to know. But why just use a password when you can use a secret language? Sounds crazy, right? Well, it makes more sense than you think. You see, during World War II, many soldiers fighting for the Allied forces were from Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And because of this, there were many different languages spoken among the troops, but the most common language among them all was English. So it only made sense to use a system that everyone knew but no one else did. The idea was simple. Every day a new password would be given to the soldiers that contained a phrase or word that was difficult to pronounce in German. For example, one day the password might be muesli bar, which contains the and other sounds that don't exist in the German language. Or another day it might be pull the other one, which contains the P sound that Germans had a very hard time pronouncing. But how did they know who the enemy infiltrators were? Well, if an enemy soldier wanted to blend in, he would have to say the password perfectly if he didn't want to arouse suspicion. And since the Germans weren't quite as linguistically gifted as the British, they often couldn't pronounce the sounds correctly. This is why the English soldiers were able to tell if an unidentified person was a spy. But the Allies didn't stop there. They went ahead and created an entire secret language that only they knew, called Nadsat. Nadsat was created by combining English with Russian words, and although it wasn't as widely used as the passwords, it was still helpful in certain situations. So, how did they come up with this secret language? Well, it turns out that the British had been spying on the Russians for years before the war even started and had taken note of their language. And so, when the opportunity to create a secret language came along, they took it. For example, the Russians would call a British domik, which literally translates to little house. The British took this word and altered it slightly, changing the H to H and adding an S at the end, making it domis. They also took the Russian word for man, which is chelovek, and altered it to K by removing the H and the V. Although the language only consisted of around 300 words, it was enough to confuse the enemy and gather intelligence without them ever knowing. For instance, if a German soldier found one of the secret phrases written down, they wouldn't understand that it was a secret message unless they knew both languages. And even if they did, by the time they decoded the message, it would be too late. While this may sound like a game to us today, back then it was deadly serious. After all, the fate of an invasion rested on the shoulders of these soldiers. But thankfully, thanks to some creative thinking and a little bit of linguistic know-how, they were able to stay one step ahead of the enemy. But what do you think? Would you have been able to infiltrate the Allied forces using this method? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.